And okay, so what we have here, this is a grotesque from the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago has a great deal of Gothic architecture. It's inspired from Oxford University, and I found this particular grotesque. I thought it'd be a good grotesque for our talk today. So Chicago is famous for many things, such as deep dish Chicago pizza, skyscrapers, and the famous architect Frank Lloyd Wright. Chicago is home to two of the World's Fairs, one in 1893 and one in 1932. And many famous people have called Chicago home. People such as Michael Jordan, Oprah Winfrey, Chance the Rapper, and Billy Corgan from the Smashing Pumpkins. However, Chicago has a very dark, twisted side to it as well. And it has a history that's deep in mobster violence, bootleggers, brothels, and mysterious hauntings. It is the home of the worst theater fire in history, and the home and hunting ground for America's first serial killer, Dr. H.H. Holmes. Chicago is also home to the story of the double baby at Hull House, which inspired the book and film Rosemary's Baby. Chicago has a sordid and disturbing history and is one of the most haunted cities in America, just behind New Orleans, Louisiana, Savannah, Georgia, and Salem, Massachusetts. So I'd like to begin with one of the most beautiful and most haunted parts of the city, that is Lincoln Park and Lincoln Park Zoo. On the left is a picture of Lincoln Park now. It's very beautiful. There are universities in the area. It's a very famous tourist attraction. There's a beautiful free zoo. And then on the right is what on the right is what Lincoln Park used to be. It used to be Cemetery Park. And it is teeming with paranormal activity today. The reason why is because between 1840 and 1869, Lincoln Park was home to the city cemetery. It was then called Cemetery Park, and it was the primary city cemetery. It is estimated that 35,000 bodies were buried in Cemetery Park. In the 1860s, there was a cholera outbreak, and officials believed that the cemetery was too close to Lake Michigan. Lincoln Park spans Lake Michigan for 7 miles, and city officials felt that the bodies from people who were dying from cholera were infecting the water supply. And so there was a call to move the bodies, to relocate them to another cemetery in 1869. So thousands of bodies were exhumed and relocated. And there is a belief that if you disrupt the corpse, you also disrupt the spirit. Therefore, there are many unsettled spirits lurking about Lincoln Park today. So there's a story of Frances Pierce. She was buried in Cemetery Park, and she was one of the first bodies to be moved to Rose Hill Cemetery. She died of cholera, and shortly afterwards, her infant child died as well. So when her husband had her body moved to Rose Hill Cemetery, he didn't have her buried in the ground. Instead, he had her casket on display, and here it is here. And it said that every year on the anniversary of her death, the glass fogs up. Not all bodies were relocated though. In 1871, there was a great Chicago fire, and it reached to Cemetery Park, and many headstones were destroyed, and with that, many bodies were lost. And it is estimated that today there are still 12,000 bodies embedded in the ground underneath the beautiful park. Often when something new is being built in Lincoln Park, they find bodies. When they were building the zoo, they were creating a farm area and they were building a barn, and they found 6 or 7 bodies in the ground. They called the city officials to ask what to do with these bodies. Nobody returned their phone calls, so they put them back in the ground. And so this is a very common story around the Lincoln Park area in Chicago, finding bodies. Like I said, it's estimated there are 12,000 bodies still buried in Lincoln Park. There is one remnant of the city cemetery left, and this is this mausoleum. It's for a man named Ira Couch. Ira Couch was a prominent businessman in the 19th century, and he owned a famous hotel downtown called the Tremont House Hotel. The Tremont House Hotel was a favorite of Abraham Lincoln. He stayed there. And ironically, his assassin, John Wilkes Booth, also stayed at the hotel. Ira Couch died in 1859, and this mausoleum was created for him. It cost $7,000 to create this mausoleum. And to put that in perspective, you could buy a house for less than $7,000 at the time. So this mausoleum still stands. It's the only remnant left of the cemetery. And people in Chicago aren't quite sure why it's still there and even who is inside. It's a little mysterious because Ira Couch actually has a headstone in Rose Hill Cemetery. So people aren't quite sure who's buried here, if anybody, and why it's still here, why it's still there. However, there is a legend that dates back from the 1880s that says that if you go to this mausoleum at midnight and you say 3 times, "This grave belongs to the dead, not the living," that a white ghost will appear. I haven't tried it out yet, but if you come to Chicago and you try it out, I'd love to hear what happens. So just west of Lincoln Park Zoo, we have got a site of gangster sites and a few spooky bars as well. So Al Capone. Al Capone is very famous for running Chicago during the Prohibition period in the early 20th century. And he is often associated with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre that occurred in 1929 on St. Valentine's Day. So I'll talk a little bit about Al Capone, and then I'll talk about the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. So Al Capone was born in Brooklyn, and he got involved in organized crime at an early age. And he was encouraged to come to Chicago in the 1920s by his mentor, Johnny Torrio. He was Johnny Torrio's right-hand man. Johnny Torrio got shot up outside of his Illinois home, and he survived that shoot up, but he decided that he was no longer going to be involved in organized crime, and he handed the gang over to Al Capone. And when Al Capone took over the gang, he expanded it to include bootlegging, gambling, and brothels. And it is estimated that he would make close to $100 million a year in the 1920s. That is astounding to me, $100 million in the 1920s. In today's conversion, that would be about $1 billion a year. So Al Capone had the city in the palm of his hand. He had paid off many officials, city officials, and he was pretty much considered untouchable. So there was a rival gang in Chicago, Bugs Moran's gang. Al Capone's gang was on the south side of Chicago. Anything south of the Chicago River was Al Capone's territory, and the north side was Bugs Moran's territory. And Al Capone wanted to take out Bugs Moran. So there's a story, 1929, Bugs Moran's group was expecting a shipment of whiskey to come in from Canada. And they all met at a garage. here, and this is the site of the garage. The garage is no longer standing. The city tore it down, but what we have here is where it was. And 7 men met up at this garage to receive this shipment of whiskey. Bugs Moran was supposed to come. However, he was running a little late. He saw a police car outside the garage, and he went somewhere else to figure out what to do. So the story is that 4 men came in, they drove up in a police car. 2 men were dressed as police officers. 2 men were dressed in civilian clothing. And the 4 of them walked into the garage armed, lined the men up, and shot them. Now, one of the men had brought his dog. His dog's name was Highball, and Highball was tied up to a tree. The dog did not get hurt in the story, but the dog kept barking and barking a lot. So you might think, well, wouldn't people in the neighborhood hear the gunshots? Yes, they did. But what the police officers, men dressed up as police officers, did is they handcuffed the 2 civilian men and walked them out, put them in the police car, and drove off. So people in the neighborhood thought, okay, you know, the police have been here, they've taken care of this, this is all over with now. However, the dog kept barking and barking, so some neighbors came over to see what was going on, and then they found the men's bodies. So to this day, no one's been charged for this murder, and this is one of the most violent executions with the gang wars in Chicago history. Nobody's been charged with it, but it's largely believed that Al Capone had called the hit. Now, the city tore down the garage, and the bricks to the garage became hot commodity. People wanted to own these bricks. If they had blood on them or bullet holes, that was even better. But strange things started happening to people who owned these bricks. They got mysterious illnesses, they got into accidents. So people thought these bricks were haunted. These bricks have been collected and have been reconstructed as a wall. This is at the Mob Museum in Las Vegas. So you could go see the reconstruction of this wall, and you can see you can still see the bullet holes and the blood on these bricks. The site where this massacre took place is also a little haunted. There are mysterious things that have happened. People hear the sound of a dog barking. Dogs that are walking by the park are really uneasy. They don't want to walk by the area. There is a story of a woman who lives in an apartment next door, and she has clothes hanging up over her mirror. People say, why do you have clothes hanging over your mirror? She said every time she would look in the mirror, she would see a man in a pinstripe suit standing behind her. And this just horrified her, so she covered up the mirrors in her home. So the site of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre has got a lot of mysterious hauntings and paranormal activity around it. The lot is still open. The city doesn't want to build anything there. They don't want people to come around, and because it's such a famous event that happened in Chicago. Not too far from the site of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, another gangster met his demise, John Dillinger. John Dillinger was a notorious bank robber in the Depression era in the United States, and he was shot down outside of the Biograph Theater in Lincoln Park on Lincoln Avenue. So in the Depression era, there was an increase of crime. This was the time of notorious criminals like Bonnie and Clyde, and Babyface Nelson, and Pretty Boy Floyd, and John Dillinger. John Dillinger robbed 24 banks, 4 police stations, he broke out of jail twice, and he killed a police officer. The head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, named John Dillinger public enemy #1. However, the public seemed to take a liking to John Dillinger. This was the time of sensational newspaper stories, and people enjoyed reading about the exploits of John Dillinger. At this time, people felt that banks exploited working class people by charging too much interest and felt that the banks could take a hit. So John Dillinger was a bit of a celebrity and he was seen as kind of a Robin Hood type figure at the time. The FBI were on it. They wanted to capture John Dillinger. And he was actually taken down in July 22nd, 1934 by two women. So he was in Chicago and he was actually going by the name Jimmy Lawrence. And he was dating a 26-year-old waitress named Polly Hamilton. And Polly Hamilton was also a sex worker on the side. And her former boss was a woman named Anna Sage. Anna Sage ran a few brothels in the Midwest area. She was an immigrant from Romania, and she was in trouble with the police. And she was at risk of being deported. And she made a deal with the FBI. She knew who her friend Polly's boyfriend was. She knew he was wanted by the FBI. And she said, okay, if you help me, if you protect me and help me stay in the country, I will hand over John Dillinger to you. So the FBI said, okay, we'll do that. So one night on July 22nd, the three of them went to the Biograph Theater to see a gangster flick, Manhattan Melodrama, starring Clark Gable. And she dressed in bright clothing to alert the FBI to who she was. And as they were leaving the theater, the FBI were on them. And John Dillinger ran down the alley, pulled out a gun, but the police shot him and he was shot 4 times and died. And like I said, he was a bit of a celebrity. And so, you know, people heard this man was shot, it's John Dillinger, mobs of people swarmed him, people grabbed buttons off his clothes, bits of his clothes to keep as souvenirs. Women dipped the hems of their dresses in his blood to keep as a souvenir. Anna Sage was running through the alley trying to get to him, crying, and his body was then taken and he was put on display in the morgue, and many people came to see his body. Since then, there has been some paranormal activity in the alley where John Dillinger was shot. So here's a picture of the alley. An artist group here in Chicago created this mural. So people started to feel uneasy when they're walking by this alley. And people have reported seeing a figure dressed in blue running down the alley and then stagger and fall to the ground and disappear. They've also reported seeing a woman in red wandering down the alley weeping. These sightings have occurred around the anniversary of that fateful night, July 22nd. I was recently on a ghost tour and we were in the Dillinger Alley, and the tour guide was saying that she's had people on her tour become really ill to their stomach, feel really sick when they're in this alley. So there's definitely some paranormal energy happening in this alley. And here's a quote from John Dillinger, this artist group put on the wall. "All my life, I wanted to be a bank robber, carry a gun and wear a mask. Now that it's happened, I guess I'm just about the best bank robber they ever had, and I sure am happy." So not too far from these sites, we have one of the most haunted taverns in Chicago, the Golden Dagger. The Golden Dagger is named after the rusty golden dagger the owners discovered in the 1970s in the wall in the basement. The tavern was built in 1894, and in the 1920s and 30s, the basement was a speakeasy and upstairs was a brothel. This was a favorite hangout for the North Side Irish gang during Prohibition. The basement in this building was supposedly used as a meeting space for the Order of the Golden Dawn. The Golden Dawn was a secret society devoted to the study and practice of the occult and paranormal during the late 19th and early 20th century. So members of the Golden Dawn included Yeats, Aleister Crowley, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and Bram Stoker. And they had a group here in Chicago, and the basement of this building was their meeting place. There was a woman who claimed to have witnessed a ritual sacrifice here in the 1930s when she attended a secret meeting with her father. She came out about this story when she was in her 80s. She was silent about this, and then she came out and told the story. So the spirit of the sacrifice woman is said to haunt the basement. So there's been some mysterious things that have happened in this space. There's a story of a man who was working at the tavern, and he went down to the basement, and he suddenly felt a chill. And then he became paralyzed and fell to the floor. He couldn't move or speak, and he was rushed to the hospital. The doctors couldn't find anything wrong with him. The spot where he had become paralyzed previously had been marked with a pentagon. There's another story of a man who was drinking at the tavern, and he wandered down to the basement. He was looking for the bathroom, but he wandered down to the basement. And when he was down in the basement, he too became paralyzed, and he saw a figure of an older woman coming near him, eyes wide open, with a white face as if the blood had been drawn from it, and a ragged hole in her chest where her heart should have been. And he was absolutely horrified from this. When the current owners took over the property in the 1970s, they uncovered Egyptian symbols and a painted pentagon on the basement floor. At first, they thought that these symbols meant nothing, and they took the dagger out of the wall. But then once they did that, mysterious things started happening. They started seeing ghostly figures made of fog in the basement and the bar area. And so they put the dagger back in the wall, hoping to close whatever Pandora's box they had opened. So the Golden Dagger has a long history, and it's undoubtedly one of the most haunted bars in Chicago. You can go there and have a coffee or a drink, and maybe the owners might let you go down to the basement and see the Golden Dagger. So this has all been on the north side of Chicago and Lincoln Park. So now let's head downtown. So downtown, here's the site of the famous Chicago Theater. The Chicago Theater was built in 1921, and it was an opulent movie house. Now it's a famous theater for live acts. And across the street of the Chicago Theater is something called Death Alley. And Death Alley is full of paranormal activity, and it is also the site of the worst theater fire in world history. So you can see on this sign here, it says Couch Place. Well, this was also where Ira Couch's hotel, the Tremont House Hotel, was built. They named this alley Couch Place originally for Ira Couch, but after a fire in 1903, the press renamed it Death Alley. So on the left side was the Iroquois Theater. The Iroquois Theater was built in 1903, and it was a beautiful, extravagant, opulent theater. It was a crown jewel of theaters in Chicago and in the United States. Owners spared no expense creating this beautiful theater. Now, they started building it in 1903, and they really wanted it open before the holiday season so they could make the most money. And so they cut some corners and paid off some people, as people do in Chicago, to get this theater open for the holiday season. And they did. So it opened in November, and things were going well for about 6 weeks. Things were going well, but there was a fateful matinee on December 30th, 1903. Now, they had spared no expense except for fire safety expense. So they cut some corners. There was no fire alarm. They did not have fire sprinklers. The fire escapes were not complete. They had exit doors, but they were not illuminated. And so this was kind of set up for disaster, and that is what happened. So they advertised themselves as being fireproof, but actually that proved not to be the case. So December 30th, 1903, it was a packed house. They had sold all 1,600 seats and then some for the standing room only. There was many children at the show. The show was Mr. Bluebeard, and it was a children's musical comedy, and it had just come off of Broadway. So December 30th, children were on Christmas break. So there were children and mothers at the show. The first act went really well. And then the second act, there was a short on one of the overhead lights. This is what it looked like. This is the scene on stage when the fire broke out. And the arrow, the X over here is the spot where the fire started. Over here is where the fire started. So there was a short on one of the overhead lights, and the curtains caught on fire. And people didn't panic at first, and they had what they thought was a fireproof curtain. So they started lowering the curtain to put out the fire. The fireproof curtain got caught in the pulley, so it was hanging midair. And the fireproof curtain proved not to be fireproof because it caught on fire. So people started panicking and rushing out of the theater. And as I said, there were exit doors, but they were not illuminated, and they were behind really heavy drapes. So people were having difficulty finding the exit doors. The people that were in the balcony were actually locked into the balcony. Between the tiers, between the orchestra, the dress circle, and the balcony, there were gates, and the gates were locked. And that was meant to prevent people from sneaking down to a more expensive seat. So the people in the balcony were literally locked in the balcony. So finally, one of the stagehands got a door open, and when he opened the door, a big gust of Chicago winter wind came in and made the fire even worse. And so people were scrambling to get out. The doors at the theater pulled in rather than pushing out. So if you can imagine hundreds of people pushing up against a door, trying to get out, people were having difficulty opening the doors. So in the balconies, they found one of the exit doors. A group of people went out on the fire escape. Like I said, they were not complete, and the fire escape collapsed, and 120 people fell to their death in that alley. So eventually the fire department came, but the fire had pretty much put itself out. And when the firemen came into the theater, there was an eerie silence, and there were just piles of bodies. And so they pulled the bodies out and they piled them up in the alley. And so in total, 602 people lost their life that day. And it is the worst theater fire in history and the worst single building fire in American history. Now, in 1926, they rebuilt a theater. They built the Oriental Theater. And this is when strange things started happening. The alley, Death Alley, is said to be full of paranormal activity. Last week, I was leading a tour in Chicago, and I had a psychic from New York on my tour, and she said that she could feel really heavy energy in this alley, a sense of sinking in that alley. And in the theater, in the Oriental Theater, when actors were on stage rehearsing, they could see shadowy figures in the balconies. They would see people dressed in early 20th century clothing backstage. So there was a lot of mysterious things happening in the theater. Now, this is really interesting. A few years ago, they were showing Wicked at the theater. And when they were showing Wicked, there was an increase of paranormal activity both at the theater and in the alley. And I have a theory as to maybe why that might have been. So The Wizard of Oz, we know Wicked comes from The Wizard of Oz. And The Wizard of Oz book was published in 1900. In 1902, there was a stage production of The Wizard of Oz. So the children who were at the theater in 1903 would have been very familiar with The Wizard of Oz. So that might be why there's more paranormal activity going on during the showing of Wicked. Wicked is coming back this fall, so it'll be interesting to see what happens. I was reading a ghost tour about a month ago, and somebody had graffiti this on the wall in the alley, "Watch for the little boy," which I thought was a bit ominous. It's no longer there, but for a few weeks, this was graffitied on the wall. Now, across from the Iroquois Theater was Marshall Field's. Marshall Field was an entrepreneur who created this big, beautiful shopping center in Chicago in the 19th century and changed the way people shopped. And for all these bodies, they needed to be identified. So he let the 8th floor of the Marshall Fields building be a makeshift morgue and hospital. So they took a lot of bodies up to the 8th floor of the Marshall Field building. The Marshall Field building today is Macy's, and it is said the 8th floor is very haunted. Employees that would work on the 8th floor would feel this sense of heavy depression. For new employees, their lockers were on the 8th floor and mysterious things were happening. Some new employees quit. They felt so uncomfortable. And so they eventually closed up the 8th floor to the building. I was at Macy's last week and I was asking an employee about the 8th floor. And she said, "Oh no, we only go up to the 7th floor. We don't use the 8th floor anymore. And the elevators only go up to the 7th floor." They said that they were trying to rent out the 8th floor for another company, but they don't use the 8th floor, which I found really interesting. So next we'll move on to the Art Institute. So the Art Institute was voted the best museum in the United States, and I agree with that. And aside from the Met in New York City, it is the most visited museum in the United States. So it was built in the 1870s, and it was both a fine art school and an art museum. They have some very macabre paintings in the art museum. One of them is Francis Bacon's Figure with Meat. And another is this painting of Dorian Gray. So a Chicago artist, Ivan Albright, was commissioned to create this painting of the picture of Dorian Gray for the film adaptation of Dorian Gray that came out in 1945. So this is one of the creepiest paintings, I think, in the museum. And I'm sure almost everybody here is familiar with Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. If not, it is a story about a man who's leading a double life. During the day, he's very charismatic and he's a very respected member of upper class society, but he has a secret life. And at night, he's going out committing all kinds of sin. He has this mysterious painting, and whenever he commits a sin, it shows up on the painting and not himself. And he doesn't grow old, but the painting becomes very decrepit. So here's a picture of the painting here. So Oscar Wilde published this book in 1891. And in 1893, Chicago met its own real-life version of Dorian Gray with Dr. H.H. Holmes. So Dr. H.H. Holmes was America's first serial killer. He was a psychopath, he was a con man, and he came to Chicago in the 1880s, and he used the Chicago World's Fair in 1893 as a hunting ground for his murder spree. So 1893 was a big year for Chicago. They held the World's Fair. So it was the 400th anniversary of Columbus sailing to America. And it was called the Columbian Exposition, or the Chicago World's Fair. And so thousands of people came from all over the country and all over the world to attend the World's Fair. And it was absolutely stunning. Everything was white, and it was also called the White City. So if anybody's read Erik Larson's The Devil in the White City, it is all about the World's Fair and Hh Holmes. Lurking within the White City was Hh Holmes, America's first serial killer, using this as a hunting ground to lure women back to his murder castle. So I'll talk a little bit about Hh Holmes. Hh Holmes' real name is Herman Mudgett, and he was born in the United States, and he came to the Chicago area in the 1880s. He was seen as being very intelligent when he was a child, and he had a keen interest in anatomy. He went to medical school at the University of Michigan and went by Dr. Hh Holmes. He came to Chicago and he worked as a pharmacist. And he's considered the first serial killer in the US. Some speculate that he is actually Jack the Ripper. So I'll talk more about that later on, the speculation that Jack the Ripper might be Hh Holmes. So I mentioned his murder castle. This is a picture of Holmes's murder castle, as it's been called. So it was this building took up an entire block. It was 3 stories. The first floor was his pharmacy. The third floor was his hotel. And he advertised this as the World's Fair Hotel. So nobody really knew what the layout of this hotel was like. What he would do is he would hire a construction company to build one part of it, fire them, hire another company to build another part of it. And so nobody really knew the horrors that were built within this hotel. It wasn't until after he was convicted of murder and the police went in that they discovered that this was a structure designed to torture people. And so what Hh Holmes would do is he would go to the World's Fair or to the Congress Hotel, where many people visiting Chicago would stay. And he would lure unsuspecting women to come. He'd say, oh, I've got a nicer hotel. It's closer to the World's Fair. Come stay here. And for many young women, they'd go in and never be seen again. Now, here is a map of what the interior of the hotel looked like. So I'll zoom in a little bit here. So we can see he would have secret passageways, trap doors, staircases that led to nowhere. He had gas vaults in rooms. The rooms would lock from the outside, not the inside. He had laundry chutes where he could put bodies to send them down to the basement. So we can see here, trapdoor leading down to secret chamber, blind room, the hanging secret chamber, dark room, room of the 3 corpses, 5-door room. And it was designed to confuse people and to trap people. And it's designed just to torture people and murder them. So he would use the basement as a space to dissect and experiment on bodies. He had a crematorium in the basement. And so, as I was saying in my talk earlier today, I was studying this the other day, and I got a little emotional looking at this. I started feeling like some strong chest pains, like that somebody built this hotel just for the means of torturing and murdering people. So that is his the layout of his murder castle. Now, H.H. Holmes, as I said, he was also a con man, and he would sell these insurance policies to people. And what he would do is he would tell these young women, I have this insurance policy. I like to take out an insurance policy on you. I will pay you $100 to sign up for this insurance policy with me. The money is yours. You can do whatever you want with it, as long as you will sign up for this life insurance policy with me. So women did, and not knowing that he was the beneficiary of this insurance policy. And so he would then murder them and, you know, take the insurance money. So this is the way that he funded his murder castle. And he had a business partner, and he and his business partner had a similar plan. They said, okay, H.H. Holmes would take out an insurance policy on his partner, and his partner would fake his own death, and then H.H. Holmes would collect the money and they would split it. So the business partner did not need to fake his own death because H.H. Holmes killed them himself. And this is what did him in. So the insurance policy scam did not go through, and H.H. Holmes was arrested and charged with murder for his business partner. When he was in prison, he confessed to killing 27 people. Sources think it's much higher, closer to 200 people. And this is something he said when he was in prison. This was part of his confessional. I was born with the devil in me. I could not help that I was a murderer, no more than a poet can help the inspiration to sing. I was born with the evil one standing as my sponsor beside the bed where I was ushered into the world, and he has been with me since. H.H. Holmes was hanged in 1896. The police went in and they discovered the murder castle. It was torn down. And what stands now there in the spot is a post office. And people say there's a lot of strange paranormal activity at the post office, particularly in the basement. That would have been the space where H.H. Holmes would have been experimenting on bodies. People who have gone into the basement say they smell a strange chemical smell. They have feelings of suffocation. There's been poltergeist activity. And people at the post office will tell you, you do not want to go down in the basement. It is absolutely horrifying. It is, people who have gone down there said they had the strangest feelings they've ever had in their life being in that basement. Now, there are places around Chicago where H.H. Holmes' ghost has been spotted. People have seen him in Jackson Park. That is this place where the World's Fair took place. There's a bridge there where he would meet up with women that would become his victims. People have seen his spirit there. His spirit has been seen in the lobby of the Congress Hotel and other spots around the city. So as I said, there is the speculation that H.H. Holmes is Jack the Ripper. H.H. Holmes's great-great-grandson is a man named Jeff Mudgett. And Jeff Mudgett gave a TED Talk claiming that Jack the Ripper and H.H. Holmes are the same people. And his evidence for this is that H.H. Holmes was in London in 1888 when the Whitechapel murders took place. There was a letter he wrote to his lawyer that is evidence that he had taken a ship over to London and was in London in 1888. Also, people who have studied the Jack the Ripper murders claim that the murderer must have had medical knowledge from the way he sliced the women's bodies. And we know that H.H. Holmes did indeed go to medical school. He was a meticulous surgeon. And finally, Jeff Mudgett took the famous Dear Boss letter that Jack the Ripper sent Scotland Yard and compared it to a letter that H.H. Holmes had written. He had taken it to a handwriting expert, and it was concluded that yes, indeed, both of these letters were written by the same hand. So this is really fascinating that possibly H.H. Holmes is Jack the Ripper. So if you do a search on Jeff Mudgett, M-U-D-G-E-T-T, and TED Talk, you can find the TED Talk. He also has a book called Bloodstains, where he, supports this theory. So I mentioned the Congress Hotel. The Congress Hotel was built in 1893 for the Chicago World's Fair. And like I said, H.H. Holmes would hang out in the lobby of this hotel to try to lure women to come stay at his hotel. The Congress Hotel is considered the most haunted hotel in Chicago, if not in the country. So the room that is the most haunted is room 441. Room 441, Stephen King came to Chicago and he stayed in room 441, and it inspired him to write the short story 1408. People who have stayed in room 441 complain about lights flickering on and off, notebooks, and remote controls being moved around. They complain of being violently kicked in the night. They complain of the TV turning on by itself and it's just static. And if you stare at the screen, you can see the outline of a woman in the screen. Employees at the hotel say they don't like to book out room 441 because people always leave early. People who stay in 441 call down for security quite often. And just people do not have a pleasant experience staying in room 441. So I went up to the hotel, I visited room 441, took a picture of it. Here it is. And you could do that too if you came to Chicago. Here's the lobby of the hotel. Now, not only is room 441 haunted, there are other parts of the hotel that are haunted as well. The 12th floor is haunted. There is a story of a woman who came to Chicago from Europe during World War II. She came with her 2 children, ages 4 and 6. Her husband was to join her, but she lost contact with her husband, and it soon became clear that her husband was not going to join them in Chicago. She had a breakdown, and one night she pushed both of her children out of the window of the 12th floor and jumped herself, and all 3 died. So since then, there is the belief that one of the little boys haunts the 12th floor of the hotel. There was a woman staying on the 12th floor, and she called security saying the children were making too much noise. Security cameras looked, there were no children on the 12th floor. Also, there's a security guard that went up to the 12th floor after getting a call of too much noise. He went up and he saw a little boy. He went up to him and he said, "Hey, you're not supposed to be here." The little boy looked at him, smiled, and then vanished. So the security guard would see this ghost of this little boy from time to time at the Congress Hotel. But I think the most disturbing thing I've heard about this story is that one night he came home from working at the hotel and was relaxing, reading a book, listening to some music, and he looked up and the ghost of the little boy was standing in his home. So the ghost had followed him home. So there are other hauntings. Al Capone is said to have played cards here every Friday night. People say they've seen his spirit around. There's been the sounds of a rowdy party, but no people are there. There's a story of a man named Pegleg Johnny who haunts the Gold Ballroom. So there's a great deal of paranormal activity here at the Congress Hotel. And some people speculate that The Shining has also been inspired from the Congress Hotel. So if you visit Chicago, you could come stay at the Congress Hotel. You could book out room 441. And be really interesting to see what you experience while you're staying there. So next, we'll talk about one of the worst aquatic disasters that have happened in the United States, the Eastland Disaster. Many people know a lot about the Titanic, but not too many people know about the Eastland Disaster. And the Eastland Disaster was actually more tragic than the Titanic. More people died in the Eastland Disaster. So this was 3 years after the sinking of the Titanic. The year was 1915. And there was a cruise ship that was to take a group of employees from the Western Electric Company on a pleasure cruise from Chicago to Michigan City. They would have a picnic there and they would come back to Chicago. And many people were really excited for this, and families bought their tickets. Like I said, this was for the Western Electric Company. So these were working class people. These weren't, wealthy people like the people who were on the Titanic. So these were working class people, and this was a day pleasure cruise. They were very excited. There were, 2,500 tickets at least that sold for the cruise ship. There may be more than that on the ship. Now, because of the Titanic tragedy, cruise ships were taking extra precaution, and they had an abundance of lifeboats and safety jackets on the upper deck. And ironically, this might have been what caused the problem. Within 15 minutes of people boarding the ship, tragedy struck. Before the ship even left the harbor, it capsized and tipped to one side. Now, there are many people who were below deck that were trapped. And when the boat capsized, the weight of other bodies and furniture slammed against these people. And without even leaving the harbor, over 844 people lost their lives. 22 entire families were wiped out with this tragedy. And this has largely been forgotten. And so there were all these bodies needed to be identified. So there were makeshift morgues made around the city to identify these bodies. And one of those buildings was later to become Oprah Winfrey's studio, Harpo Studios. So it was in this time period in 1950, it was made into a morgue. And there's been a lot of paranormal activity in Harpo Studios. There's like the sounds of children playing. Security cameras caught the image of a woman in a gray dress. Oprah Winfrey called her the Gray Lady. Oprah Winfrey devoted a number of her shows to the victims of the Eastland Disaster. Also in the harbor where this tragedy took place, people who are kayaking hear the sounds of someone knocking on the bottom of their boat. There are patios, restaurants have patios close to that harbor, and people who are outside dining will hear the sound of someone drowning. They call the police, nobody's there in the water. So there's a great deal of paranormal activity happening around the Eastland. So I see that it's been about an hour. If you need to log out, thank you so much for being here. But I will continue on and tell a couple of more haunted Chicago stories, and we'll close up here shortly. So Hull House. Well, the story of the Devil Baby at Hull House is the inspiration for the novel and the movie Rosemary's Baby. Now, Hull House is on the University of Illinois Chicago's campus. And it's a museum today. You could go visit it today. It's a museum. So in the late 1800s, Jane Addams bought Hull House, and she used it as a center for people who are new to the city, immigrants, poor people, people who are marginalized from society. She was a social reformer, and so she built this home. She bought this home and built this space to help those who were in need in the city. And in 1913, what came to her door was the devil baby. Now, the legend is this is the legend, but there was a couple that had newly immigrated from Italy. The woman was very religious. Her husband was not. She was pregnant. She was expecting her first child. One night, she and her husband got into a big fight. And the husband said, you know, I would rather have the devil in my house than to have my child believing in all this religious nonsense. Well, a few months later, the woman had her baby, and the legend is that the baby was born with big yellow goat's eyes, red skin, and hooves 4 feet. And they didn't know what to do with this baby. They thought this was the child of Satan. So they took the baby to Hull House, and Jane Addams took care of this baby, and the baby stayed up on the 3rd floor attic. And people in the town in Chicago heard that there's a devil baby at Hull House. People lined up at the doors, wanting to get a glimpse of this baby. Jane Addams denied it, not wanting to tarnish her reputation and draw more attention to this case. So eventually the story died out, and we're not quite sure what happened to this baby. We don't know. It might have been taken to another institution, but there's also the story that there was a mercy killing in Hull House, that one of the caretakers killed the baby to put the baby out of his misery, and Hull House is haunted as a result. And they say in particular that the staircase is haunted. Now, before I heard this story, I went to Hull House and I took some pictures. It was at night. I took some pictures, and I got this one. And there's just this mysterious, looks like kind of like eyes, these mysterious lights that have come up on the stairs here. So I'm not quite sure what that is. But Hull House is also said to be haunted by the ghost of Jane Addams herself. And from Mrs. Hull, the home was owned by the Hull family before Jane Addams bought it. And it's meant to be haunted by Mrs. Hull as well. So you could visit Hull House, take lots of pictures. You never know what mysterious lights or eyes or orbs might come up in your pictures. So I will conclude our talk with talking a little bit about some of Chicago's cemeteries. Chicago has some beautiful cemeteries. One is Rose Hill Cemetery. Now, after the bodies were relocated from this cemetery park, after the cholera outbreak, many bodies were relocated to Rose Hill Cemetery. Also, many of the victims from the Iroquois fire are buried at Rose Hill Cemetery. And I talked about the story of Frances Pierce. She was one of the first bodies to be moved from Cemetery Park to Rose Hill, and her casket, or the casing around her casket, fogs up every year on the anniversary of her death. I also saw this, I thought it was really beautiful, Lulu Fellows. I'm not quite sure why people put money in her case. I'm not sure, but I thought it was a beautiful sculpture. Graceland Cemetery is absolutely beautiful. It's also an arboretum. There's a sculpture here called Eternal Silence. And the legend is, if you look into the eyes of this sculpture, you will see your own demise. I've never done it. I don't want to know, but that's the legend. And there's a story of Inez Clark. Inez Clark was 7 years old, and she was outside playing, and she was struck by lightning. So the story is that when there is a storm, her statue disappears. Also, she wanders around the cemetery, but only children can see her. So Graceland is actually my favorite cemetery in Chicago, and I think it's absolutely beautiful. Finally, there's a Resurrection Cemetery. And Resurrection Cemetery is connected with the story of Resurrection Mary. So Mary was a woman who liked to go out dancing. And in the 1930s, she was out dancing and she got into a car accident. And it is said now that her ghost haunts dance halls in the area. People have seen her spirit hitchhiking, and she wanders around Resurrection Cemetery. So the story of Resurrection Mary is one of the most famous ghost stories in Chicago. If you do come to Chicago, there's some great ghost tours. There's one called Ghost City Tours. Those are downtown walking tours. I work for this company. Also another one, U.S. Ghost Adventures. They do primarily Lincoln Park walking tours. And the third one, Chicago Hauntings, that is a bus tour. And so 2 books that I would recommend. One would be The Devil in the White City by Eric Larson. This is all about the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 and how they rebuilt the city, the architect Daniel Burnham, the Chicago World's Fair, and H.H. Holmes. A lot about H.H. Holmes in here. And I'd also recommend any books by Ursula Bielski. She's like the ghost authority here in Chicago. She has a number of books. So anything by Ursula Bielski would be excellent if you wanted to do more research on Chicago ghosts. So Chicago is teeming with paranormal activity. We've had a very sordid past with gangsters and bootleggers and brothels and some serious tragedies with fires and the Eastland Disaster. And there's still lots of spirits lurking about. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate you so much. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about Chicago haunting.